in some of the cases, at some points, or sometimes, depending on certain circumstances, they're absolute. They exist unconditionally. I remember I had this exchange once that wasn't particularly amicable with the writer at Time magazine named Joe Klein over civil liberties. And at one point, he was writing all sorts of angry and insulting things. And at one point during this rant, he said, and besides that, what we have to understand is Greenwald is a civil liberties extremist. And I remember at the time thinking to myself, this is so strange. He's writing all these really bad, hurtful, nasty, insulting things about me. Why would he just stop in the middle and suddenly praise me in this way by calling me a civil liberties extremist? I didn't really get that. And then it actually dawned on me that by using that term, he actually meant that as an insult. That was supposed to be an insult. And I found that so confusing because the nature of civil liberties is such that if you believe in them, you essentially, by definition, are expressing extremist ideas. And the reason for that is because the civil liberties that exist are expressed in absolute extremist terms. I mean, just look at this list that we call the Constitution. It's very aggressive in its rhetoric, and it's very radical in the way that it expresses itself. It says things like, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or freedom of the press, that the people shall be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures, that right shall not be violated, that warrants shall not issue except upon probable cause, that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. You cannot believe in these concepts without being an extremist. To believe in the Constitution is to be a civil liberties extremist, and that's what makes this concept so crystal clear, is that the list that was put forward, that we've all agreed to live under, is a list that is definable and tangible and easily found. It's easily understood, and it's intended to be as crystal clear and absolutist as possible. So although the term civil liberties may strike all of us at first glance as being difficult to understand and define, the opposite is really true. It is a term of ultimate clarity. Now let's look at the other term that is in the title of the event, and that is what I think is the key term, and that term is terrorism. Now terrorism is, I think, exactly the opposite in terms of how civil liberties is understood. If you were to say to most people, do you have a pretty good idea of what terrorism is? I think most people would say, oh yeah, I mean that's terrorism. I mean that's a super easy term to understand. I mean everybody knows what that means. We talk about terrorism all the time. We all agree it's this horrible menace, that it justifies all kinds of aggression and violence, that we need to protect ourselves from it. We don't really seem to have much difficulty figuring out who the terrorists are and who the terrorists aren't, at least in popular political discourse. And so I think for most people, unlike civil liberties, which strikes a lot of people as unclear, terrorism seems to be crystal clear. The reality, though, is just like with civil liberties, exactly the opposite. This is probably the single less clear or most unclear term in the English language. I've actually described it as being the most manipulated term and therefore the most meaningless term. I actually think it's a term that completely lacks meaning at this point, or definition. And if there's any doubt about that, I would defy anybody to try and offer a definition of terrorism that is actually consistent with how that term is popularly used by our government and by our media. I guarantee you that no matter whatever definition you offer me, I will be able to point to countless cases where that term is used inconsistent with the definition that you've offered. And a term that has definitions that are used inconsistently with the term itself is a term that by definition lacks meaning. In order for there to be a term that has clarity, you have to be able to say what it is that it means and to be able to point to consistent applications. Terrorism is a term for which there is no such definition that gets consistently applied. And that's not really an accident. If you look at the history of the term terrorism, it's really quite fascinating. The term has been used for a long time. I mean, you can go back and find isolated instances of it being used centuries ago. Even some French revolutionaries were described as being terrorists, using the French word that is still today used to denote that word. But it didn't really have popular, consistent, regular usage until around the 1970s, when the Israelis started to try and institutionalize, to start trying to formalize the term to describe what their Arab enemies were doing, and particularly what the PLO was doing. So the Israelis decided to try and formalize this concept that would, in essence, delegitimize and criminalize the violence that was used by their enemies against them, while at the same time finding some way to exclude the violence that they used against their enemies so that only the bad violence got called terrorism and the good violence got called something else, self-defense. And what the Israelis decided after a few years of making this effort, of trying to recruit the world into this concept, into this effort to demonize their enemies' violence as terrorism, was that it would only work if the concept became universalized, so that it wasn't just the Palestinians and other Israeli enemies who were being called terrorists, but all enemies of the West, whom the Israelis were seeking to recruit into their conflicts in order to claim that we all had a common enemy, not just the Israelis, but all of us were fighting against the same enemy, namely the terrorists. And so what happened was in the 70s and 80s, there were efforts made on the part of the UN and other international institutions to come up with a working definition of terrorism, one that we all agreed to that would be a formal definition that you could point to. The problem, though, was, and it was a pretty significant problem, which was that the goal was to create a definition that would allow us to call Arab and Muslim violence and the violence used by enemies of the United States terrorism, but that the violence used by the Israelis and the Americans and our Western allies somehow would be excluded. And it's really hard to do that when the acts are absolutely identical. I mean, you cannot come up with a definition that would exclude one and include the other. So there was a pretty creative attempt made along these lines that today endures, which is terrorism was going to be the targeting of civilians for violence in order to advance political ends. That is a pretty basic definition, the targeting of civilians with violence to advance political ends. The problem, of course, is that all the nations that do exactly that on a regular basis would have been swept up into that definition. And so the solution to this problem was they just added another factor to the definition, which is targeting of civilians with violence to advance political ends when done by non-state actors. So that violence done by non-state actors would be terrorism. The exact same violence done by states would be something else, legitimate use of force or some other kind of term. And so this was the ultimate effort that was settled upon. That too, though, created lots of problems. One problem was that the state of Israel was founded upon the use of violence directed at civilians for political ends by non-state actors. That was a pretty significant problem, was that the Israeli government was filled with people who, under that definition, would be called terrorists. Another problem with it was that the United States, during the 1980s, when these efforts were most underway, was feeding arms and money and all kinds of other aid to non-state actors targeting civilians using violence for political ends, including in Central America, and particularly in Nicaragua, where there were the Contras, whom the United States was funding and arming, and yet they were doing things like blowing up buses and shooting nuns and all kinds of other violence that meet the classic case of terrorism. And then there were other problems with it too, which is that we had a list that we still have today that we've titled State Sponsors of Terrorism. So we've decided that states themselves can't be terrorists, but they can sponsor terrorist groups. And we had a list of various states that we decided fit this definition. And one state that was on it for a long time was Iraq. And there were all kinds of laws. You weren't allowed to give money to state sponsors of terrorists. You weren't allowed to engage in any kind of commerce with them or visit them. Similar prohibitions that we have today. But then what happened was there were conflicts that broke out, such as the Iraq-Iran war, where we decided that we actually wanted to give arms and money to Iraq. And the problem was Iraq was on the list of state-sponsored terrorism, and the United States law prohibited any aid from going to this state. And that was a pretty big problem too. And so we just took Iraq off the list one day so that we could then send Donald Rumsfeld to shake Saddam Hussein's hand in the famous iconic photograph that shows him doing that, so that we could arm Iraq at will. And then once we were done doing that for about 8 or 10 years, and we decided we didn't like Iraq anymore, back on the list that they went. And so what you see is this extraordinarily inconsistent use of this term. It is clearly a term that simply means whatever the wielders of the term want it to mean, whatever it is in their interest for that term to mean at any given moment, which is another way of saying it's a completely meaningless term. It's basically a term designed to provoke emotions, to shut down rational faculties, and to disseminate propaganda. And I just want to look at a couple of recent examples that illustrate just how true that is, to illustrate how right today we continue to use this term every bit as deceitfully and manipulatively and inconsistently as the Israelis and the Americans were doing in the 70s and 80s. Look at the incident about 6 months ago now, where an Army psychiatrist named Nidal Hassan went to a military base in Fort Hood, Texas, and targeted troops, active duty troops, who were getting ready to deploy to war, and shot 14 of them and killed 13 of them. That act, because he was yelling things, according to witnesses, that are associated with Islam, was immediately and widely and without much question deemed to be terrorism. This was a terrorist. And yet, Nidal Hassan targeted a U.S. military base and targeted soldiers deploying to war that represent a country which every political leader of that country for the last decade has been running around screaming everywhere they could, "We are a nation at war." And if targeting troops, military troops, on a military base of a nation that is at war and that says that it is at war is terrorism, then that term really has no meaning. Because even the early definitions of terrorism that didn't work, every definition of terrorism didn't work, all involved the targeting of civilians with violence, not the targeting of members, active duty members of the military, especially ones getting ready to deploy to war. I mean, we bomb and drone and otherwise destroy military installations all the time throughout the world, and we immediately say, well, this is a military installation, of course there's nothing wrong with that. And yet here was somebody doing that to us, targeting a military base, shooting active duty soldiers, who immediately was branded a terrorist. This was an act of terrorism. You can look up any newspaper that will describe